Hello and welcome back, part 2 with Chris Robertshaw. We were on FOIs really, I think. And can I...
Well, we're just starting FOIs.
We are, but you know when the Chief came on Sunday with my the programme X Radio, and we had potentially what was going to happen. He suddenly announced on the Sunday that the FOIs were going to be released early the next week. And I questioned, I didn't get an answer. There's 3 different silos, 3 different departments, all decided suddenly to get together. No, not to get together, to independently release the information to me. That was wrong, right? Because if it did happen independently, it's remarkable. It's getting a full house, isn't it?
It's wrong in detail, but I think there are more substantive issues that we need to address.
I'm just trying to question the fact that suddenly they all came out. But,
Yeah, well, I think they came out because they knew the game was up, because the slap we just discussed in the first part had failed miserably and was, frankly, a complete embarrassment. And the advice must have been, look, you've just got to do it.
My theory on this is that Kate Brunner, the KC, is doing the inquiry, and she will be looking for this information herself. So I'm thinking she's probably been given this information, and once they know the inquiry's got the information, then they will have to come clean, because they know it's going to come out sometime, and holding me up any longer with the amount of hoo-ha I'm creating was just irrelevant by that stage. They had to, and it didn't make them look good, let's face it, but they almost, this is it, we're going to have to put it out in the public domain. They could have done it 3 months early, whatever it was, done it.
But turning to the inquiry, I mean, you may be right, I don't know, but at least the FOIs are out. But on examination, there are certain issues about the FOIs that are actually concerning, and that is the concept, I'm going to bore people a bit here, the concept of metadata examination. I'm sure you know as well that the vast bulk of the FOI documents coming out from the various departments, and here we are talking about a similarity across the piece. It sort of answers your question, doesn't it, that you just posed before, that the metadata was missing. Now all right, I'm speaking way after the date, but I just don't think it's acceptable to issue an FOI, a document in response to FOI with all the metadata removed. It's a little bit like the post office in years gone by, because that's where we're thinking now, that they stamped postage going through their system without the date on it, or that people sent letters without the date that they wrote the letter, or that offices receiving documents in didn't stamp the document in with the date they received it. This concept of when you send something, when you receive it, that is very important, and that's reflected in documents subject to FOI requests in particular. They must display when those documents were originated and when they were dispatched or distributed or whatever. What actually happened with the bulk of the FOIs, that they had no metadata on them at all. So one can assume that those documents were tampered with in any shape or form that was required prior to them being exhibited as FOI documents. That is not acceptable. And okay, if we missed it in the FOI, in the original FOI Act, then it needs to go in at some stage pretty damn quickly.
Okay.
But what's worrying is the fact that, and it begs a huge question, why on earth did they remove all the metadata?
Okay, we haven't done anything on this yet. We are discussing this. This is all news to the audience, that we've gone through everything we've been given with, luckily, a person who has incredible detail on looking at metadata, and we haven't even touched on this one yet, because, as you just said it there could be an open to suspicion that why haven't we got the original? You take it off the server, you hand it out. Why has it got to go through some other device, be re-looked at, stripped of everything, and sent on? So stay tuned. I think that one's due to come out next week.
Let me give you an example of why it's important. If we go back to Dr Ranson's tribunal, and this concept of concocted documents, there were 2 particular documents, Z309 and Z475. Now, the metadata associated with those documents showed that they originated in one place and, as it were, were dealt with again months later, in both cases, months later. And the outcome documents, the comparators, the comparison between the two was very, very different, which is why the accusation arose that there are such things as concocted documents. Now, that
allegedly, because he went to Expol, did this whole forensic £67,000 thing and said there was a bit of people were tired, there was a bit of human error, but they saw nothing wrong.
The only reason this hasn't gone any further is not because the alleged concoction was disproved. It wasn't the part of the tribunal to examine that. It's for others, and thus far nobody's examined it. And I was sort of willing to let that go by, but now we've got a situation where the metadata has been removed. It's almost as if, oh look, we nearly got into trouble there, we nearly got found out, allegedly, that there were concoctions. We better avoid that in the future by removing the metadata. Well, my advice to them is stop doing that. Well, and you'll also notice, I think, if I'm correct here, that the documents went through somebody very high up in GTS.
Okay, you can't. Honestly, I don't know how much I want to say at this moment, but you can't make some of the stuff up because they haven't been completely good at what they were doing. I mean, it's gone through a washing machine and stripped, but
allegedly.
Well, no, it's clear. There's no metadata. I mean, that's a fact. What we've got on certain documents has come up with nothing at all.
We lose reliability of
it has to have some metadata because it should say when it was formed. So
yes, exactly.
So it's been some things being taken out completely, and something hasn't.
In future, any FOI document from government must exhibit its metadata. Otherwise, it completely loses its validity and could be anything.
I'm going to tell you what's going to happen from now on because this thing will erase it. And so this person has told me what they'll do. They'll take the document, they'll put it on a scanner, they'll scan it, and then they'll reinsert it because it's no metadata then can be transferred even if they didn't want it to be. And that's probably what's going to happen until, you're right though, until a law comes in to say you must leave the document. It has to come off the server and placed into the FOI intact. No alterations, absolutely. No amendments, or the risk of potentially thinking there has been any alterations or amendments. I think that's more important, isn't it? You want to have faith in that document being the document and not something that may have been
Businesses and the
changed.
post office would not dream of not dating its documents. And we can't put ourselves in a position where government is allowed to exhibit documents without validation of date. It's just not acceptable. And perhaps we could sort of leave that there. Okay, so one of the things that came out of the FOIs was, from those who've read them anyway, was a sense that there was a contempt exhibited by the writers. For the sake of ease, they've been nicknamed the gatekeepers. Yeah, okay. That they were high-handed and arrogant in their opinion of how Comyn should deal with the matters that they were dealing with. And what I want to say here is that that's not special or specific, or unique rather, should I say, to this particular issue. This is a culture that goes way, way back, that the leadership, the CEOs, the COG group have developed a contempt for Comyn. There's nothing new about it at all. Just for once, it's been shown to exist. It already did. Now, the conclusion from that is that if the COG group are determined when it suits them to show contempt towards Comyn, they're actually showing contempt towards the House of Keys, and therefore, by definition, they're showing the leadership of the CEO, the bureaucracy, the civil service, are showing contempt for the electorate. That's the conclusion you arrive at, and there is no doubt that was the undercurrent that definitely existed. Oh, they won't be. The inference definitely. When you read it, you cannot but agree with this. That they can't cope with that much detail. They've only got so long, and so on and so forth. I mean, goodness me. The first duty of a senior civil servant is to give the options to the politician fully and openly. And they must do that. They can recommend a particular route, but they've got to exhibit and show the Council of Ministers what the options are. Later on, we'll look at why they didn't do that.
Well, I was going to say, in my last piece, again with advice, we looked at what the civil servants are meant to do, duty-bound by their own code.
Yes, indeed you did.
And clearly, you may say there's an inquiry there, at least, because it looks like they didn't necessarily pass on everything that they should have done.
They didn't.
Well, No,
they didn't. Hang on a second. No, they didn't. But it's very easy with hindsight to offer criticism. And I before this interview, I thought I really need to sit down and think through myself the circumstances that those officers, that incredible pressure they were working under at that time. I mean, it was in the week ending Friday the 13th, the World Health Authority had announced that it was formally a world pandemic.
Sure, this was the start of it though, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Remember, this is the start.
Yeah, I mean, the crucial period, there are one or two other areas peripheral to this, but the main area is the period Friday the 13th of March through to Monday the 16th, and perhaps back to the 9th and forward to the 27th. This period needs very, very special examination. I am actually, incidentally, concerned about Kate Brunner's review, insofar as she, and you've said this yourself, so we're just repeating something, but it's important. She has no power to ensure that the documentation is all that it should be, and that it contains what she needs. And she has said, has she not, that that she has the opportunity to consider a public inquiry. Now, quite rightly, the Chief Minister, I think right at the very beginning, said this whole matter needs to be examined. We don't want to go down the public inquiry because it'll take an eternity of time and be very expensive. But now we're in a different position, excuse me. We're in a position now where there is a greater knowledge and understanding of where the issues really lie. And I cannot believe that it's impossible for the consideration to be given for public inquiry legitimation, if you like, to consider certain crucial and key parts of the whole process that we went through dealing with the COVID crisis. It could be done quickly and it could be done fairly inexpensively. And now we know that the FOI documentation submitted to you was inadequate because of the metadata omissions. I think we're getting very close to that point of having to say, this is what we need if it's going to enjoy public confidence.
Let's just remember, right, when the FOI was first answered back, because I was looking between the Friday the 13th and the Monday, they said there was no correspondence between the gatekeepers, remember? And I went, that's impossible.
You did.
And then what happened? Reams has come out now.
Absolutely.
So you've got to question, this is exactly what we're questioning, is that can you trust people to release information? They can simply say they haven't got it, but once you've got a public inquiry, you're under oath, you've got all the legal powers.
Yes, exactly.
There. There's something different when you put your hand on that Bible or affirm, whatever you want to do.
Well, yes, you're liable.
Because you could be lying if you don't do it right.
You are hugely liable.
They lied by saying nothing existed between Friday and the Monday. And then suddenly, when the push comes to shove, they come up with all the information.
That was the arrogance issue again of government.
It's lying, isn't it? They said there was nothing there.
But was that exceptional, or was that the form that government's got? And I would suggest it's the latter rather than the former. But what I want to look at now is the mindset of the gatekeepers. Now, we know who the five were. Dan Davis had the special role of, I think it was coordinator of emergency response. Now, he had to get documents prepared for the council meeting on Monday the 13th of March. I think it started at 9 o'clock. And there was a lot to do in a fairly short time. But he had round him, he had Caldrick Randall, who was the Treasury Chief Financial Officer. He had Mark Lewin himself, Catherine Magson and Will Greenhow. Now, what you've got to remember, for those who don't know, or can remember this, and why would they, that the WHO had announced the week ending Friday the 13th of March, had said that this is now a world pandemic, in the first instance. And extraordinarily, that same week, the Friday, the 13th, my goodness me, what a weekend that was. The Friday the 13th, it was announced that the Isle of Man was going to adopt the delay policy that was the
NHS
policy.
England.
Yeah, NHS. In other words, we won't make any decisions ourselves. We won't think about it. We're just going to blindly follow the UK. That was the position, certainly, that the DHSC was taking, and very definitely, through evidence, the position that Catherine Magson was taking. So that was the background to the work that we now know was done over the weekend between what we now call the gatekeepers. Put yourself in Dan Davis's shoes. He had to consolidate a document to submission for the Council of Ministers on the Monday. And each officer would have been responsible for, as it were, submitting their view from their particular responsibilities. Caldrick Randall had a responsibility to ascertain what would the implications be of major policy change on the finances, on Treasury's finances. That was his contribution, so that was financial. You had Mark Lewins, whose responsibility was, quite clearly, what's the impact going to be if we move away from delay on the private sector, on businesses, which obviously he would have said is very, very significant. You've got his position, Dan's position as the coordinator. You've got the overseeing role of the Chief Secretary, Will Greenhow, and then you've got the contribution that should have come from the DHSC, expressing and explaining the absolute importance of changing policy. Why? Why should that have come from Catherine Magson and did not? We know that now. It's because...
No, Catherine Magson did do it. You talk about Dr Ranson, it should have come from.
No, the information came to that group from Catherine Magson because she was in...
Yeah, it came from her, yeah.
Yes, right.
But I think you're trying to say it should have come from Dr Ranson. Right?
No, it should come from Catherine Magson, and she should be advised by Dr Ranson. But what happened over that weekend was that Dr Ranson, who was trying really hard to as it were, gain time to get the hospital in order so that it could deal with an influx of cases in intensive care, totally legitimate and totally right. By Sunday night, she was getting Dr Ranson was getting extremely anxious. She called an emergency meeting of the 10 senior doctors on the Isle of Man. They all attended that meeting and unanimously said, this is a real crisis, we have got to act immediately. And Dr Ranson then consolidated a report from the doctors and herself, submitted it to David Ashford and Catherine Magson in absolute clarity, hoping that it would be submitted to the Council of Ministers on the Monday. Didn't see the light of day. The information, as far as we can establish now from Dan Davis, is that the information he received from Catherine Magson was very much contrary to the advice she was getting from the medics. Remember, now we know Catherine Magson had no medical qualifications, and neither did any of the other 4 gatekeepers, and yet they were making advisory submissions to the Council of Ministers on the Monday, completely out with the medical advice that was coming from Dr Ranson,
and there are 10 other doctors
and the 10 other, yeah, I mean, that's an extraordinary situation. But Dan Davis was in an impossible position because he was hearing private enterprise impact advice, Treasury advice from the Catherine Magson. He wasn't getting the advice he should have done, and in some respects Dan Davis did his best, I think, to consolidate a compromise position between the absolute no, which was the position he found himself in, and the advice he received from the medics, which it wasn't for him to say individually, this must go forward. It should have come from Catherine Magson because she did the presentation to the Council of Ministers on the Monday. So what those 5 did was effectively totally close out the medical advice, the consequence of which is the borders didn't close. Comyn, I talk about contempt for Comyn. Comyn were never advised of this. Not the only people who knew about Catherine Magson's submission on the Sunday night, and remember, I think you said it was in red letters. This is an extreme emergency. Brushed aside. The only people who saw it were Will Greenhow. No, little surprise perhaps that Will Greenhow's no longer with us, and Catherine Magson. Little surprise she's no longer with us.
Do you agree then the unfortunate term, as it's now been put by the DHSC, that Dan Davis used in his email, this is toned down? Yeah, he used those actual words.
I think Dan Davis was trying to find a hopeless compromise because...
But he'd seen the original presentation,
yes, but yes, his role... It wasn't Dan Davis's role. Dan Davis's role was to produce an emergency response. He had to rely upon the DHSC to provide up-to-date, accurate information to the Council of Ministers. That was their role. Dan Davis couldn't usurp that. The major failings were Catherine Magson, because she didn't, bear with me, didn't transmit that information, and Will Greenhow, who must have been involved in Catherine Magson's original recruitment, and must have known she had no medical background whatsoever, and that what he was seeing happen, bear with me on this, what he was seeing happen was advice going to Comyn which had no input from the medics at all. Absolutely extraordinary and unforgivable. Put Comyn in an impossible position. And then what happens later on when the COVID infection gets into Abbotswood is Tynwald is shut down. I mean, what a state of affairs that is if you take it as a whole. But I don't think Dan Davis should be made the whipping boy on this. It runs a lot deeper. Now, back to an earlier point, and I'm sorry I'm going on because this is...
That's Tom Soon, this one.
This is very important.
Yeah.
Is that this culture didn't emerge spontaneously from a crisis. It was actually the culture that existed within the COG for a long time, having this arrogance and disregard for the elected representatives, and I'll finish on this because I could go on for hours.
Oh, sorry. We did that session.
It relates back to the improper structure of our organisation. Our structure brings people naive to politics, very quickly promotes them to minister, has them rely absolutely on their CEOs, who in turn have got far too much power, and that power has a form of corruption, which has resulted in a contempt for the Council of Ministers, and the result of all of that was the Council of Ministers never got the advice they should have had.
Okay. Do we need to do another section, or you?
Yes, I think
we'll do that. Okay, just leave you on this thing. Back to Will Greenhow. We keep mentioning him. He went very quickly from this whole thing.
I'm not surprised.
But he never gave evidence to that committee. And there's an example.
I'm not surprised.
Will he give evidence to Kate Brenner? Will he or won't he? And if he's made to, the only way to do that would be to have a public inquiry.
That's why. This is so serious for the good government of the Isle of Man that it's either a public inquiry or it's a commission of investigation that needs to be adopted. One or the other has to be done. Otherwise, I can't see an alternative.
Right. Expensive, whatever happens, but
no. A commission of investigation doesn't cost the Isle of Man anything. It's where the Isle of Man would choose to reach out to, I think it's the Justice Department, and say, look, we need some help here. And there's nothing untoward about that.
Oh, okay.
They would take the cost of it, and they would assist to help put the Isle of Man back on the right tracks.
Wow. Okay. Food for thought there. That's part 2 done with. There's more.